Major tension between India and Pakistan after India launches airstrikes in Pakistani-administered Kashmir and in Pakistan itself. This follows the terrorist attack in April that left 25 Indians dead. What does it mean for the region and for world security? We will discuss those questions on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, joining us is friend of Newscast, Jeremy Bowen. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello, Adam. Nice to be back.
Thanks for coming back. And making their Newscast debut, joining us from Delhi, is my colleague, Arunoday Mukharji. Hello, Arunoday.
Hi again. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So, Jeremy, just give us an update of what we think happened on Tuesday night.
Well, the Indians, since that awful attack a couple of weeks ago, in which, 26, I think, people were killed, tourists who were enjoying the beauties of Kashmir, the Indians have been increasingly angry. There has been definite hints and indications that they were moving towards a military strike. They'd also suspended a water treaty, considered a very important thing between India and Pakistan about water sharing, a treaty that had been going since 1960, a long time ago. It was the year I was born, an awfully long time ago. And it had held up to now, and now it's been suspended. Pakistan very angry about that as well. So what happened was, in my time here in the UK, sort of just sometime after 9 o'clock, so in the early hours in Pakistan, the Indians attacked. They hit 9 places. It's not entirely clear what sort of weapons they used, but it seems to be a combination of missiles, drones, aircraft. The Pakistanis are claiming they shot down perhaps as many as 5 aircraft. No independent verification nor indeed Indian confirmation of that. Quite a lot of people have been killed in that initial attack and in artillery exchanges along the line of control in Kashmir, which is this disputed area, which has been disputed ever since partition, back when the British quit India in 1947, and in the ensuing hostilities, what happened was that Kashmir ended up divided, and it has been a bone of contention, to put it mildly, between India and Pakistan ever since then. And so where we're at is that the world is now waiting to see what Pakistan does, because the word escalation has been used a lot about the way this crisis could take off. Always a problem in a crisis, a real problem when the two players in that crisis both have nuclear weapons.
And Arunoday, what are the Indian government saying about what they've tried to achieve with these strikes?
Well, they've been very clear that this was a calculated strike specifically targeting what they say are terrorist modules or terrorist camps, which is why the words that were used by the Indian Foreign Secretary earlier in the morning when he conducted that press briefing, he said these were measured, non-escalatory, proportionate and responsible strikes in Pakistani territory. So very carefully chosen words essentially to highlight that they were only looking at targets which were potentially a threat to India. In fact, the Foreign Secretary also saying that Indian intelligence's monitoring of, quote, Pakistan-based terrorist modules indicated that further attacks against India were impending. So therefore, the argument that India seems to be putting forth is that this was a compulsion to both deter and to preempt any kind of further attack. So that essentially is the argument that India is putting forth. It was a strike on multiple locations, 9 to be specific, according to the Indian Army, over 25 minutes. So within 25 minutes, this entire sort of, the strikes played out. They again categorically said that these were targets based on credible intelligence. And what's important is, they said that they had successfully destroyed the target. So in tone and tenor, there seemed to be a finality when the Indian government was speaking. Even the handle of the Indian Army on X said that justice served was the hashtag that they used. Now, if you just dig deep into the kind of language that is being used, there is a sense that, this was something that was coming. The Prime Minister, in a public meeting had also said that we will be pursuing the attackers and their backers, quote, till the ends of the earth. So that kind of talk has translated into what transpired overnight. And as far as India is concerned, from India's point of view, the message is clear that they have done what they had to do in a preemptive strike to take out what they are saying were terror targets.
And Jeremy, for people who aren't familiar with this part of the world, this will seem like quite a dramatic, shocking development. But actually, this is the latest in a long line of things like this over the decades.
Yeah, India and Pakistan have gone to war different times. There have been various levels of exchanges along that line of control in Kashmir. And when there have been incidents, there have been attacks and reprisals, and there's been a pattern. I think why people are worried is this is big in terms of the way that India responded, in terms of the initial killings as well, and a feeling too, I think, that in the prevailing mood of nationalism in India, in the government, that they would be pushing hard on this. We've been talking. It was interesting hearing just now about the way that the Indians were hoping to draw a line under it. It's honor satisfied. We've done what we had to do. Our message has come through. But Pakistan now has its own deterrence to think about because, first of all, I think what we're hearing from the many people who've been interviewed by the BBC and others, government officials and people on the ground there, are saying that there's a lot of public anger about what India has done. So the government will feel under a lot of pressure to respond, and they've said they will respond. And they also have to think about their deterrence because they don't want to get to a situation where whenever India has a grievance against Pakistan, they have a sense that they can just, let's go and hit some targets in Pakistan and really make them sit up. So they need to attach a price to this. But that's when it gets complicated because how they select the targets, how many people they kill, the way they calibrate what they're doing in terms of what sort of response it gets back, it elicits from the Indian side. All that is the way that these crises escalate. So if they somehow get it wrong, or if there is often in these situations, there is misperception on either side, they're not quite sure what the other one is doing. And that's the way that crises catch fire.
And Arunoday, just give us a bit of a geography and history lesson here. And Jeremy's mentioned this phrase line of control a few times. Just zero in on that.
Sure. It's hard to explain Kashmir's history and the bloody past that the two countries have shared in a nutshell. But let me give it a shot. It's a long and troubled history, that dates back, as Jeremy said, to 1947, when Britain divided the territory it had ruled over into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Now, at that time, Kashmir, which is to the north of both countries, beautiful surroundings, big mountains, a big favorite with the tourists. So Kashmir was given a choice at that time, either accede to India or go to Pakistan. Now at that time, incidentally, the local ruler of Kashmir, who was a Hindu, initially wanted Kashmir to be independent and agreed to accede to India only for protection after a Pakistani tribal army attack. Now that's when a war broke out between the two newborn countries, the first one. Now, over the years, the region continued to be disputed, triggering two wars and limited conflict between India and Pakistan. At the moment, there is a de facto border recognized internationally dividing the disputed region into Indian and Pakistani-administered Kashmir, which is called the line of control. You'll be hearing a lot of that in our reportage. Now, both countries claim the region in full, but they control only in part. And since the 1990s specifically, there's been an armed separatist insurgency against what they say is Indian rule in the region, and that's claimed thousands of lives, including those of civilians and security forces that we keep reporting about. India, in all these decades, has continued to accuse Pakistan of backing these separatist forces, charges which have always been denied by Pakistan, but this has been India's claim and allegation year after year whenever there has been any kind of attack on civilians or even security forces, and this time is no different. But what is different this time around is the attack that we saw on the 22nd of April was one of the it was one of the worst attacks targeted at civilians in recent history. You've seen in 2019 the attack on paramilitary forces, which claimed 40 lives. 2016, if you go back, there was an attack on Indian Army soldiers in Uri, again, Indian-administered Kashmir. That claimed 19 lives. But this, perhaps since 2008's Mumbai terror attacks, this was one of the biggest attacks targeted deliberately at civilians, which is why you've seen the kind of anger and shock in the entire country, and that pressure on the Indian government to act. And as Jeremy said, this is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government with a few coalition partners. This is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which has always championed a very muscular brand of Hindu nationalism, of talking tough on terror. So this is a government that has in the past, in 2016 and 2019, carried out airstrikes in the past in Pakistani territory. So a lot of experts had said that, look, there is a benchmark. India can't fall short of that. They've already done this under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership. So this time, what's going to be different? And we've seen that. And just quickly, there's a lot of sort of symbolism. Just the fact that they've called this Operation Sindoor, there is also a war being waged on that front, on symbolism. Sindoor essentially is the holy vermilion that is applied by women in the parting of their hair by Hindu married women. So the message really is to Pakistan that, these are the women who were widowed, and India is trying to seek revenge on that. So the symbolism, the military action, it's all combined for a government which has been always talking very tough on these kind of issues.
Wow. And Jeremy, what's the international reaction to this? Which countries are trying to intervene, and is there anything they can do to sort of stabilize the situation?
Well, the Indians have been in touch with the Americans, with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. I think the Pakistanis will have as well. Britain's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has called for restraint, so is his French counterpart. I mean, there's alarm about this. It's quite muted, I think. They don't want to try and get ahead of themselves, overexcite matters. But there's always this worry that if a crisis between India and Pakistan escalated into an all-out shooting war, that both sides have these nuclear arsenals. And that is obviously highly destabilizing for all concerned. It makes people nervous, the thought that, and again, I've used this phrase, let's not get ahead of ourselves. They have not been rattling the nuclear saber. You think about the way that President Putin, when the war wasn't going quite as well as he might have expected, or when he thought that Ukraine might be getting a little bit too much help from the West, he quite deliberately started talking about using tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I haven't detected either side talking about that, but they're in the background. I mean, that is the issue. So that is why big countries and medium-sized countries like the UK, but with a history in the region, are concerned clearly about that and are wondering about things they might do to try to calm things down. There's always talk about off-ramps in these crises. What's the off-ramp? How do both sides manage to step back with honor satisfied, with a feeling that, okay, we've made our point? And I think it's clear that the next stage will be that Pakistani response. So I think perhaps what they're trying to say to the Pakistanis is, look, be really careful what you hit here, guys, because we do not want to get to a situation where the Indians feel honor bound to hit back, not just honor bound, well, in terms of upholding their sense of deterrence, which, of course, as I was saying earlier, works both ways.
And Arunoday, you've done a brilliant job today as a journalist. I just want to ask you, as a person living in Delhi, with everything we've just been talking about and the risk of escalation and the ultimate escalation being nuclear, how does that feel as a person there right now?
That's an interesting question. It does cross our minds in that sense. We've covered conflict in the past, but this seems obviously a bit closer to home. And there are families involved. There are all sorts of layers that you think about as you go on reporting. And, this is not something that we've seen at least in our lifetime so far. We've heard this from our parents, who've lived through the wars in the past, 71, 62, 65. in the 1900s, of course, we've heard stories about mock drills being conducted, blackouts, people having to sort of switch off all the lights and being very alert, hearing air raid sirens in the past. So this is the first time we're actually hearing these kind of mock drills being conducted and across a lot of the areas which are closer to the border. So we're in Delhi, so significantly far away from the border, but this is where the government sits. So a lot of the orders are coming out of here. So we're obviously listening and sifting through a lot of this. So this is the first time that we're hearing about schools being shut or measures being taken. Individual gated communities where people live, they have individual independent circulars sort of rotating in WhatsApp groups talking about what to do, how should we prepare ourselves. This is fairly new for a lot of us, and sort of you take it in your stride, but if you just pause and think for a bit and wonder, as we think about what could be the possible retaliation that Pakistan might be considering, I'm not going to lie, these are things that definitely do come to mind.
Well, we'll be thinking of you over the next few days, Arunoday. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And Jeremy, thanks to you too.
Thanks again. Yeah, good to be here.
Now, a mega scoop interview for the BBC. It's with former President Joe Biden making his first public intervention since he stood down as president 100 and something days ago, because we just had the 100th day of the Trump presidency. He has been speaking to the BBC's Nick Robinson in Delaware, the state where he has made his home for many decades. And it's a fascinating interview, and it comes at an interesting time. And it's also linked to the commemoration of VE Day, which is being marked in Europe and around the world this week. And I'm pleased to say that Nick Robinson is here, along with his Today programme cousin, Justin Webb, who's also here as one of the hosts of our American politics podcast, Americast. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
Do you want to do the plug for political thinking, first of all? Because that's partly why this came about.
Well, yes. I mean, Joe Biden gave us this splendid interview for the Today programme originally, thanks to the producer Kirsty McKenzie, who wooed the Biden team, said, come and talk about the 80th anniversary of VE Day celebrations. But the joy of having a long, extended political interview format, political thinking, now on TV as well as on radio and downloadable on BBC Sounds, is you can hear the whole thing, and you can now hear the whole thing.
Plug over. Justin, a bit of geography. This interview took place in Delaware, which is central to the Joe Biden story, if not American geography.
Oh, absolutely. And it's central to America's view of Joe Biden because of what he made of it. So it's a state pretty close to Washington, D.C. You can get there famously in Joe Biden's case, but you still can get there on Amtrak. It's a train ride away. He famously, in his early career in the Senate, he used to go back every night. And of course, he'd had that awful tragedy. There's the deaths in his family. He needed to get back to see his surviving kids, etc., etc. And he made this little state of Delaware mainly famous, actually, for companies incorporating there for
very
tax
low
reasons
tax
we won't
rates.
go into.
Yeah.
But actually, and it's got a beautiful, we used to go with the kids from DC. It's got a lovely place called Rehoboth on the coast. And it's got a kind of sense of being close to DC, but also far away from it. I don't know what Nick's view was when he got there, and kind of it just has this sort of otherworldly, maybe slightly nostalgic feel to it as a place.
Yeah, we did the interview in a hotel built in 1913. Usefully, I know that because
That's old, by the way, in American.
Yeah, quite. That's the Wi-Fi code with something like Hotel 1913. And yeah, there's a sort of grandeur about it, really. Central Wilmington. This is home for Joe Biden, has been since the age of 10. When he came to do the interview, I think it took him 8 minutes to get from his, no doubt from his breakfast table to come and join us. And it's a place he's known and liked. I mean, what was striking is that the staff, many of them knew him. He'd launched his career there as someone less than 30. Now that matters because you can't go into the Senate until you are actually 30. And he loves telling the story of how he was elected at the age of 29 and short by a few days of that threshold and had to wait to take up his seat. He launched the campaign at the hotel. He launched his successful presidential bid at that hotel too, which he told me with great joy after the interview because it was a hotel owned by Republicans. So for him to use the gold ballroom and launch his campaign. But just is right. You feel like you're in Biden country. The Amtrak, the rail station, is named the Joe Biden station. There are buildings that welcome you to the state, which are called the Joe Biden Welcome Center. He is pretty much everywhere in that state. And as he wandered out onto the streets, he wanted to point out to me the place that he'd made a decision to go into public life. He'd quit a job as a tough private sector corporate lawyer persecuting people, and he said he'd marched across the street in order to become a public sector lawyer instead, to fight for the little guy that he always says he represents. A bus went past, somebody stuck their head out the window and said, "We miss you, Joe." And believe me, it wasn't one of those where the politicians said, Q, here's $100. They really did. I'm sure if I'd looked not very hard, I would have found plenty of people who didn't vote for him and voted for Donald Trump. But there's an affection there.
And Nick, one of the lessons I've learned from you about a good interview is that you need to have a sort of, I mean, you maybe wouldn't use the word thesis, but you have to have a sort of a frame for the conversation you want to have, rather than it just be a list of random questions. And your frame for this interview is kind of linking VE Day, the Second World War, and global security now, and Joe Biden being the thread between those things.
Yeah, and let's be clear. Thank you for saying that. I'll try and do interviews.
Professor Robinson.
But it was because that's what he'd agreed to do. So the pitch to him was an interview reflecting both on the history of VE Day and what you could learn from the history. So if you don't know that, you might come to the interview and say, well, why didn't you ask him about Gaza? For goodness sake, you have to ask him about Gaza. Why didn't you ask him about tariffs? Why didn't you ask him about this or that? Time was limited. We got longer than I was expecting, but it was limited. And all interviews are a form of deal, not a deal that says we tell you the questions, not a deal that says we won't ask you certain questions, but a deal that's what you've agreed to do. And that was appropriate, really, because the interview is broadcast in a week of commemorations of people remembering people who've fallen. And the message he came to sell, really, my worry was that it would be an elderly gentleman with a lot of nostalgia. He came with a very clear contemporary message. The Atlantic Alliance is under threat. It's under threat from the man he never names, but we know who he's talking about, Donald Trump. And wake up, everybody. He was effectively saying, you in Europe, you in America, young people in particular, we get this wrong, you lose democracy.
And we can have a little listen to that.
My father and mother's generation knew what was at stake. They knew that that democracy was literally hanging in the balance. Adolf Hitler, had he won, had there been no united Europe and united with the United States, the United States has never been able to avoid a war in Europe. And so one of the smartest things we did after World War II was we formed NATO, because alliances provide security. And imagine had we not done that.
Yeah, Justin, there was a little tell in what Joe Biden says at the start of the interview. He says, the call I'm making today. So, yeah, this just wasn't just a meandering chat through history, as interesting as that might be. He had a purpose.
But American politicians, senior politicians, don't do interviews with the BBC by mistake. They don't sort of fall into them thinking, oh, nice British chaps with or chapesses with nice accents, that would be fun. They do it with a definite purpose. So when I interviewed Obama, it was because he wanted to do outreach to Iran, and the BBC had just started the Persian service,
right.
And they didn't give a monkey's what I said or the English language bit of a deal. All they cared about was, is this definitely going to be translated into Persian? And I can't remember I think it was the beginning of kind of Thor with Iran. He had a message that he wanted to get through. And with Nick, this time round with Biden, absolutely, of course, he wants to make, and he still believes, and this we might discuss in a minute about whether it's true or not, he still believes that he is a player to the extent that it is important what he says and that people listen to what he says, and Nick is the conduit.
And did he seem like somebody who thinks he's still a player, Nick?
Oh, yes. I mean, I joked with him off camera that I'd been following him around because, as it happens, I presented the Today programme from the Pope's funeral, and he, of course, was one of the guests of the Pope's funeral. And I don't you mind me saying, he said that leader after leader had come up to him at the funeral, because, of course, there were many there, and had said, in effect, we wish you still were. We wish you were still there. And his power, and he made a joke at his own expense. He said the value of being the old guy, I think he called himself, is he knows them all. I mean, remember that he had 8 years as vice president. He had 50 years in public life, many of them in the Senate dealing with foreign affairs. So it isn't hyperbole to say that there pretty much isn't a world leader who he doesn't know by first name, hasn't had important exchanges with. And therefore he thinks, yes, they're telling him something. They're saying we're worried. And I thought the most striking warning he gave actually was buried away a little bit in what he said. I had to urge my colleagues here, said, no, look at that bit. He said at one point that because European leaders no longer had faith in American leadership, he quoted Macron as saying, yeah, it might be back when you're in power, but how long will that last? The danger is that bordering countries with Russia, to use his word, accommodate the Kremlin. They change their politics, they change their policies, they change their outlook so as to not offend, to not draw the eye of the Kremlin.
Some of the NATO countries are going to decide that maybe, especially those along the border with Russia, may just say, we got to make an accommodation. We got to make an accommodation. We got to give Russia more space. We got to go on. We have to yield to the pressures, whether they're economic, political, or military.
Reason I think that matters so much is that sometimes, particularly with younger people, they're like, what are you saying? If he conquers Ukraine, he's going to march into, name a country. And his point is, you don't need to march in. If people are intimidated, if they think you might just one day, then what happened to Finland after the Second World War became known as Finlandization, namely that the country was intimidated by the presence of the Soviet Union on its borders and effectively did a deal. You won't invade us, and in return, we won't do things you don't like. That could happen for country after country after country.
The threat might not be what you think the threat is. Justin, what was your take on the conversation Nick and Joe Biden had about the extent of American support for Ukraine to fight off the Russian invasion?
Yeah, well, there was a really interesting exchange where you're kind of pressing him, Nick, about whether enough had been done and why it hadn't been done in the first place, and the extent to which Russia could be poked. I can't remember what the exact words were on either side, but there's this kind of real sense of him explaining why it was that he went quite slowly. And a lot of people, a lot of the shtick now in the Trump administration was, look, this wasn't going anywhere. You can hammer us all you like for imposing an unjust peace on Ukraine or whatever it is you say we're doing, but actually we're doing something, and he wasn't doing anything. And I thought it was interesting in kind of explaining that, and explaining his incremental approaches. Incremental approaches in politics are not so fashionable in the modern era, but he made the case for it.
No, he did. The case was a start one. It was World War III.
Yeah.
He essentially said if he'd done what, for example, Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, has now publicly said should have been done, give them more weapons, give them longer range weapons, allow them, in other words, to attack Russian targets deep within Russia, not just give them weapons to defend on the border. If he'd given them permission to use weapons, because sometimes they had the weapons but were not given American permission to use them in that way, the Storm Shadow missile, for example, that would have risked, as he described it, a full-scale confrontation between NATO and Russia, and that would have risked the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and that would have risked World War III.
The idea that they could win without engaging NATO in a war, NATO having engaged the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, is not likely. We gave them everything they needed to provide for their independence, and we were prepared to respond more aggressively if, in fact, Putin moved again.
Plenty of people, they will say, just as Justin has, look, you willed the end, but you didn't will the means. You allowed Ukraine to survive, but you didn't allow Ukraine to have the chance to win.
And he also said the trigger for America upping the ante would be Putin upping the ante and going further than he had done, which is a reminder that actually Putin hasn't really escalated in a big way. okay, it might feel that he's escalating a lot if you're a Ukrainian soldier on the front line, but actually there was talk a few years ago of Putin using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield or opening another big front somewhere else. And actually that didn't happen. And Biden is reminding us that there was a parallel universe where those things would have happened and America would have had to respond to that.
That certainly is fear.
Yeah. Right. Donald Trump, the person who sort of haunts this interview, but not by name.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Justin will know better than me, so I'm interested. Was Joe Biden simply abiding by a convention? And there is a kind of convention that former presidents don't attack their predecessors, or at least they don't for a while. I mean, obviously, when it comes to election time, they do. Joe Biden's already given a speech, by the way, condemning cuts to Social Security. It's not the first time he said anything disobliging. Was that the reason he uses phrase like the current administration, the current leadership, and not the word Donald Trump? Or is it simply the contempt he feels for Trump? Means he simply doesn't want to say it.
It's the latter. I don't think he wants to say it, and I don't think he wants to remind people and remind himself, actually, about the very fact that Donald Trump is president. I don't think he can bring himself to go there. So, yeah, there is a convention, but I think it's more a political thing that presidents don't like to talk in terms about someone they can't stand. And
it's not politesse.
Yeah, it's not politesse, no.
And I don't know whether you think this, Justin, but I think part of his justification for himself of keeping going, of not standing aside from the race, giving plenty of time, not just to Kamala Harris, but perhaps a range of candidates to run in that election against Donald Trump, is he's always convinced himself he's the only guy who could win. That this Joe from Scranton, blue-collar Joe, the guy who talks to Joe Sixpack, the guy who understands what we call middle class, what we call working class, but Americans usually call middle class in politics, ordinary people, was that he uniquely had that connection with the sorts of people that Trump was wooing, and that pretty much anybody else would have been seen as liberal, metropolitan, in inverted commas, woke, interested in the agendas of kind of the universities and the young, not interested in what gets votes.
Yeah, we can hear the bit of your conversation where you asked him why he didn't give up earlier.
I don't think it would have mattered. We left at a time when we had a good candidate. She was fully funded. And what happened was, I had become what we had set out to do. No one thought we could do. And become so successful on our agenda, it was hard to say, no, I'm going to stop now. I meant what I said when I started, that I think I'm prepared to hand this to the next generation.
And Justin, I was intrigued to hear that because, I mean, I remember that period very well where you and I were doing emergency episodes of various podcasts on Sunday evenings at 10 p.m. because he was giving up. And I remember at the time, Biden's fight back seemed to kind of keep hold of the nomination, seemed to be kind of happening in private and in the form of letters. And he did maybe like one or two interviews, but which never really landed. That's the first time I've really heard him giving himself a full-throated defense of why he should have stayed.
Yeah.
And it is interesting hearing it from his mouth and seeing the situation through his eyes at that point. I mean, again, I'm being super nice and much nicer than history has been.
You're much nicer than history. You're much nicer than me. If I could say, in the context of that summer, it really does sound just delusional for him to say we were doing very well. They were not doing very well. He was on course to lose and had been on course to lose for some time. Trump was on course to win. Something had to happen. That is why they arranged this incredibly early debate in the early part of the summer, which they don't normally do, which was the one, of course, where he crashed and burned. So they knew he wasn't doing very well. He must have known he wasn't doing very well. What I wonder is when he was talking to Nick about that, and I just kind of racking my brains trying to think, what on earth is he talking about? Maybe he meant we were doing very well politically way back in the midterms in 2022 when they were doing really well politically. And they had a much better result, the Democrats, than they were expecting to have. And that was the moment where I think a lot of people thought, well, I mean, he talked in terms to Nick about, I'm still the guy who was going to pass on the torch to the next generation. He failed to do that at the moment after those midterms when he could have done. And that could be because actually, politically, he was doing very well.
I'm guessing, and I stress I am guessing, this is not something he said to me off camera, because oddly he didn't want to reflect much on his political failures off camera. He was keener to show us a ballroom where he'd started a successful campaign.
And you didn't feel the need to press him there.
Yeah, say, look, hold on. Come on. I found myself thinking, was he just terrified of being a lame duck president? I mean, we sometimes use the phrase in British politics, but I don't think it's the same. We used it when Tony Blair announced in advance he was going to
You mean
retire.
when everyone knows your time is up, the power drains away instantly?
Instantly. And I think he does think, and you could hear at one point in the interview, he lists his achievements, that they were making real achievements economically, that this big investment in infrastructure, this investment in green energy and so on, might not have been popular. It didn't deliver because inflation, in a sense, was more important. The price of eggs and the price of gas was more important to voters than that. But he thinks it was incredibly worthwhile doing and important.
When I left office, we had created more jobs than any president in history of the United States in one term. Our economy was roaring. We were moving in a direction where the stock market was way up. We're in a situation where we were expanding our influence around the world in a positive way, increasing trade. We regained control of what we invented, the control of the future of computer chips, which control everything. We were in a situation where there was growth, opportunity.
And I wonder if a bit of him, again, we may be being too generous here, just thought, look, I'm making progress here. If I announce, hey guys, we won the midterms, I'm out, he's instantly history. Forget twisting an arm to get a Senate vote. And more to the point, don't forget, Democrats then say, we don't really care what you think, we want to distance ourselves from you in order to win this election.
Which would have
we've
led
got
to
a
them
different
winning,
agenda.
potentially. I mean, that's the point.
That's the irony.
awful irony of
Yes.
it, is that exactly that. That would have happened, what Nick says, and it would have probably resulted, I think it would have resulted in Donald Trump not standing himself. I actually, because he decided to stand and announced his decision within days, I think, of the results of the 22 midterms. He was at quite a low point. A lot of people, Ron DeSantis was the only Republican who'd done really well in those midterms and really made a name for himself and roared back in Florida, and all the way, everyone was talking about him. And Trump, I think, if the Democrats had selected, crucially, a younger person, never mind who it was, a new generation, I don't think Trump would have got the nomination.
What, because he then becomes the old boy?
He becomes the old boy, and either he would have seen
Who
it,
talks nonsense. I mean, that's not my judgment, but then what would have been stated is, you know, listen to him rambling on, which he did. Remember a whole series of rallies. There were
if the Democrats had chosen a young, vigorous governor, and suddenly the nation is asked, do you want to go back to Donald Trump, or do you want this young, vigorous governor? And I think there's a very good chance that he wouldn't have stood.
There is, by the way, as you probably know, already a bookshelf of tomes about this decision. I mean, there's a new one out, and they're very brutal to Joe Biden, and particularly people around Biden. They blame his wife, Jill. They blame some of his closest advisors for not letting him go, or at least not confronting him with the reasons he ought to go, covering up that he was bad. And by the way, those books are all about an alleged, and I stress the word alleged in inverted commas, cover-up by mainstream journalism to not point out his failings and his weaknesses.
But I think to bring it back to the interview, the two things I think about that section is, one, it's that classic politician thing of thinking that they've won the battle in front of them, whether it's with their cabinet colleagues or the civil service or the legislature to get their thing through, thinking that's the end of the story. Is like, no, it has to deliver for your voters. Just getting your legislation through isn't victory. And the second thing, it's like, it's not always the case that these are like crazed dictators desperate to hang on to power at all costs. It's like there can be a good faith argument you make with yourself that I'm the right person to carry on. It's not venal.
Well, in a sense,
necessarily.
he gave us the good faith argument.
Yeah.
He was saving the world. I mean, look, that's not his phrase.
And that's why it's interesting to hear it from him in his own words, rather than it being interpreted by everyone else.
No, quite. But if you believe, as he does, that Donald Trump is a once-in-80-year threat to democracy, those are his words. If you feel that Europe will collapse in terms of its resolve to stand up to tyranny. If you believe that you're the guy who, unlike the other guy who might get into office, is actually going to lead Europe to stand up to Vladimir Putin and stand up to the guy in the Kremlin, it isn't delusional then to think, just keep going. Keep going. Now, in the end, if you know, well, that's only going to last a year, 2 years, because he's going to win anyway, which we do. We have the benefit of hindsight. Then, of course, you think, well, why don't you do this other thing? Why don't you stand down and let someone else stop Donald Trump? But I think that's what I found most striking asking the question. And you can probably hear in the way I asked the question, I've kind of slightly veered off VE Day. You know, I've broken my own rule. And the reason I'm being cautious, by the way, and people sometimes don't understand this about interviews, is I'm thinking we're over the 15 minutes that we agreed. We couldn't complain if they wind it up. This is a moment that someone could say, no, stop, right. You know, it wouldn't look good for them if they had. But you're trying to persuade him to go with you and answer these questions. I was just struck by he became incoherent almost.
Yeah.
That was the moment. Not because, as some people cruelly say, you know, old bloke who doesn't know what he's talking about. It's like he hasn't really got a decent answer. It was a difficult decision. Then he said it was a hard decision. Then he said, well, we'd found the candidate, we got the money.
Isn't it staggering that he didn't have an eye?
He
I think
didn't
you're
really.
exactly right. You're exactly right. He wasn't expecting to go there, but then surely he should have expected that you'd at least give it a go.
Yeah.
And his people would have known that. And in normal terms, you would come up with something that you wanted to say about that, just as he was coming up with something he wanted to say about the defence of Europe.
Now, as we talk, I'm very aware that he is doing another interview with Jill, his wife, on the sofa, and it very much is on the. Nothing wrong with sofas. We're on the sofa now.
Yeah.
But he's on the sofa with
much
Whoopi
tougher
Goldberg.
sofa.
Yeah.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
from Nick Robinson to Whoopi Goldberg.
He really is, and you know, because it's one of those kind of zoo formats with 3 or 4 other presenters as well. You know, will he go further? Will they think he's got to say more about that, or will they? Will they be nice and not ask him?
What is just, I think, my main takeaway from it, and apart from all the news lines and the great interview, is just the sense of wistfulness around it. And that's partly because you're doing the interview partly through a historical lens, and also just the fact that he keeps talking about the Soviet Union and then catches himself and says, the former Soviet Union, Russia. And you're like, this is a person with like more than one foot in the past. And that's quite, wistful is the word I would use.
Yeah.
Even though Joe Biden clearly wants to be still thinking about the future and commenting on today's world.
But he raises the question in the interview, in effect, hanging over it, is maybe all this stuff about when he stood down and he was the cat, maybe none of it matters because we're in what he calls a once in 6 or 8 generations. Why he picked those numbers, who knows? But he effectively
Isn't that like
means
250 years?
Yeah, can't be that much. But in other words, a moment of change. And he, maybe he's torn about whether this is just one of those moments. That the war is so long ago, the Second World War, that the notion of the Atlantic Alliance is so, as it were, hoary. There are so many reasons, and you've done them many times on this podcast, from COVID to inequality to mass immigration, why electorates care about something else more than this defence and security stuff, that maybe it is the past. And in a way, if that's the only thing that comes out of this interview, it becomes quite an important moment. He is looking us all in the eye and saying, is this world dead? With all the consequences there might be.
And
want
next
it to be dead.
And next week on Political Thinking, Xi Jinping. No pressure.
Well, the thing is, but there are plenty of Democrats who say if it is dead, you killed it, Joe, and you stood it. There was an absolutely devastating piece in the New York Times just at the time when he was being pressed to resign after the debate, and he was being pressed by a lot of senior Democrats. And Tom Friedland, very much a kind of New York Times Biden-supporting journalist, very august journalist on the kind of centre-left in America, wrote this piece which ended with the words something along the lines of Joe Biden, his family, his helpers, his political staff, if he stays and loses, he will never be able to show his face. That was the end of the sentence. And what really, he's shown his face now to Nick. As Nick says, he's doing another interview. It appears there's some kind of an effort to get him to be still a commentator on world affairs beyond VE Day. How feasible is that when so many people think that the decisions he made, for all the reasons that we've gone into that maybe were genuine and all the rest of it, but he made one monumental, catastrophic error at the end of his political career. And, you know, the extent to which you survive that, well, Nick's the great political thinking guy. It is fascinating, isn't it, how political careers can unwind.
They all, as the cliche goes, end in failure.
Well, I can tell you two are used to having a 3-hour-long radio program every day because we've got to wrap up now. But Nick, thanks very much for your great interview.
I thought you were going to ask us to fill the rest of the 3 hours. I'm sorry.
2 hours, 10 minutes to go. And Justin, thanks for bringing a bit of Americast to Newscast.
Good to be here.
And that's all for this jam-packed episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.